May 1945, Northern Germany. The war is over, but the silence that follows feels heavier than artillery fire. Dawn settles over a ruined street. Roofless homes, shattered windows, the faint smell of smoke still clinging to the air. Allied boots crunch over broken cobblestone as a column of soldiers moves past craters filled with rainwater. Their uniforms are clean, their stomachs full. Behind them, hidden in the doorways and shadows, a thin line of children watches in absolute stillness. They don't cry. They don't call out. Hunger has taught them not to waste energy. A young Canadian corporal pauses for a moment. His breath hangs in the cold morning air. From the corner of his eye, he sees a little boy, barefoot, maybe 6 years old, clothes hanging from his frame like wet rags. The corporal knows the orders. No contact, no gifts, no food, no exceptions. Germany must feel defeat. That is what the policy says. Yet his hand drifts to his pocket, brushing against a small piece of his ration bread. He glances at the officers ahead, then at the child again. The boy doesn't move. He only watches. The corporal slows his pace, knowing the consequences and knowing what hunger looks like. And to understand why this moment mattered, we must step back into the world that Germany woke up to in the spring of 1945. Germany's surrender on May 8, 1945, ended the fighting, but not the suffering. When the guns fell silent, the country that emerged from the smoke was barely a nation at all. Cities were craters. Villages were skeletal frames of timber and stone. Rail lines lay twisted across fields. Bridges collapsed into rivers, and roads were choked with burned-out vehicles and wandering civilians. 20% of all housing was gone. Millions had no shelter, and the harvests of the previous year had been nearly destroyed by bombings that crippled transport long before winter arrived. Into this devastation came the Allied occupation forces. American, British, Canadian, French, and Soviet divisions dividing the country into zones of control. For the Western Allies, the US and UK policies were clear. Germany must never again be able to start a war. Every directive flowed from that idea. The immediate objective was not German welfare, but German disarmament, demilitarization, and the prevention of any rapid recovery. Food was rationed carefully. Industry was dismantled. Transportation remained restricted. Even humanitarian aid was considered dangerous, something that might soften the consequences of Nazi aggression too early. In the summer of 1945, the official stance of the US and UK was stark. The German population would not receive more food than necessary to prevent disorder. Former enemies were not to be comforted. Many policymakers believed hardship was a natural and unavoidable result of Germany's own actions, its invasions, its destruction, its hunger blockades across Europe. There was a sense, particularly among British officials, that easing German suffering too quickly would insult the nations that had endured occupation and starvation under Nazi rule for years. Behind the policies was a second challenge: millions of displaced persons, slave laborers, prisoners, refugees, were scattered across Germany, all needing immediate food, medical care, and transport. Their needs came first. German civilians came somewhere far down the list. The Allied supply chain, stretched thin from years of war, struggled to feed even its own troops. Every calorie was counted. Every ration had a destination. And Germany, by design, was to receive only the minimum. As a result, daily calorie allotments for German civilians often fell below survival levels. In some areas, especially in the British zone, the numbers dropped toward 1,000 calories a day. For children, whose bodies had been weakened by years of war and malnutrition, the impact was devastating. Pediatric hospitals reported severe underweight cases, failing immune systems, and entire wards of children collapsing from hunger-related infections. Winter worsened everything. Coal shortages meant unheated buildings. Families burned furniture to stay alive. The Allied troops walking the streets saw it all firsthand. They saw the gaunt faces behind broken windows, the elderly standing in bread lines for hours, the children scouring rubble for anything edible. Yet the order from above remained firm. No food sharing, no private distribution, no fraternization with the population. Enemy contact was considered a threat to discipline and security. Giving food to a German child was, in many units, an offense punishable by military reprimand. For soldiers trained for years to fight an enemy, the transition to occupying a starving country created a tension no manual had prepared them for. The war had ended, but the consequences of war had not. The ruins made everything visible. Hunger did not hide. And within this hard landscape, a quiet clash was beginning. Between policy and conscience, between punishment and compassion, between the rules written on paper and what soldiers saw with their own eyes. It is inside this conflict that the next layer of the story emerges. The ruins created a strange kind of equality between civilians and soldiers. Hunger erased pride. Even the youngest no longer cried for food. They watched, silently calculating which soldier might have something to spare. For the families who survived the bombings, daily life became a ritual of endurance. Mothers traded heirlooms for a handful of potatoes. Fathers searched the countryside for farms that might sell scraps from the previous year's harvest. Many children, already weakened by wartime shortages, collapsed from exhaustion on their way to the nearest aid station. Those who lived near Allied barracks learned the sound of mess tins and field kitchens. They waited at a distance, close enough to smell the food, far enough to avoid being chased away. To the soldiers who passed them each morning, the sight became impossible to ignore. Every hollow face told a story of survival that stretched far beyond surrender. The war had turned an entire generation into witnesses of deprivation, and no policy document could make that sight feel acceptable. For the occupying forces, the situation carried a different weight. They had trained for combat, not administration. Many arrived expecting victory parades and orderly transitions, only to find towns filled with disease, bodies still unburied, and civilians fighting over moldy bread. Their orders, to remain distant, to avoid contact, to enforce strict rationing, clashed with what they confronted each day. American and British units enforced non-fraternization rules rigorously in the early months. Soldiers caught giving food could be reprimanded, reassigned, or disciplined. Officers reminded them that compassion might be exploited, that the remnants of the Nazi system still lurked beneath the rubble, that Germany must learn the consequences of its actions. Yet many soldiers soon realized the policy was less about security and more about maintaining psychological separation from a defeated population. Ironically, the enemy they had been taught to fear often turned out to be starving families simply trying to survive. The contradiction shaped the occupation experience in ways that no strategy meeting could fully control. Among the Allied troops, the Canadians occupied a distinct position. Stationed largely in the northern regions, Schleswig-Holstein, parts of Lower Saxony, and the approaches to Hamburg, they encountered some of the worst food shortages in the British zone. Unlike longer-serving British units hardened by years of Blitz-era memory and wartime losses, Many Canadian soldiers felt a certain emotional distance from European grievances. They had fought fiercely, but they had not endured Germany's occupation firsthand. This difference mattered. It created a space in which empathy could take root. In town after town, Canadians found children waiting near vehicle depots, leaning against lampposts outside supply points, or gathering near the entrances of mess halls. Some soldiers began by leaving small amounts of food on windowsills or low walls, pretending not to notice when it disappeared. Others slipped biscuits or chocolate from their ration packs and dropped them casually where a child might reach. These were quiet acts, not declarations of defiance, small gestures from individuals who felt the rules did not account for the reality in front of them. Behind these gestures was a deeper moral conflict. Soldiers understood the reasons behind harsh occupation policies. They knew the atrocities that had scarred Europe. They had walked through the camps where survivors lay skeletal, barely alive. They knew the destruction Germany had caused across the continent. Yet here, in the ruins of 1945, they faced a new truth. Punishment easily crossed into suffering, and suffering fell most brutally on those who had the least to do with the war. Children bore consequences they never chose. The moral line between justice and cruelty blurred with every hungry face. Many soldiers wrestled with this tension in silence. Feeding a child was forbidden because it undermined policy, but not feeding a child felt like betraying something basic, something that came before nationality or orders. In the end, these competing forces created a quiet resistance, shaped not by ideology but by the recognition of shared humanity. The acts of feeding were not simple. They required planning, caution, and a small network of soldiers who trusted one another. Canadian units developed informal methods. Some placed extra bread in the rear compartments of trucks, signaling to local children with subtle gestures when the coast was clear. Others convinced cooks to over-prepare certain meals, creating a surplus that could be disposed of without raising suspicion. A few soldiers positioned themselves between officers and waiting children, blocking the view while rations changed hands. In rural areas, field kitchens near barns or river crossings became unofficial meeting points, where soldiers served a spoonful or two more than regulations allowed, knowing those extras would end up in small hands outside the line. These actions were rarely discussed openly. They were understood, but not spoken. Tiny operations conducted in the shadows of a devastated country. And slowly, as the months passed, these quiet exchanges began to challenge the rigidity of occupation policy itself, setting the stage for a moment that would force the issue into the open. By late 1945, the quiet generosity that had begun as isolated acts was turning into something larger, something impossible for officers to ignore. In the northern British zone, where Canadian divisions were concentrated, reports circulated of children gathering near barracks entrances at specific times, always just after the midday meal, always waiting for the same groups of soldiers. What had started as a handful of discreet gestures was becoming a ritual, and rituals have a way of drawing attention. In Hamburg, a city crushed by firestorms and starvation, the situation reached a breaking point. The winter cold hardened the rubble and thinned the faces of the young. Canadian patrols moving through the outskirts found groups of children fainting in the streets, their bodies unable to endure the walk from the slums to the food distribution centers. Field kitchens, instructed to count every ladle, quietly exceeded their limits. A few cooks began boiling oversized batches of soup, prepared to discard excess portions in places where they knew children searched. But soldiers could no longer pretend these actions went unnoticed. One afternoon, near a temporary kitchen set up beside a collapsed warehouse, a British officer witnessed a line of German children collecting the scraps from Canadian mess tins. It was the moment the unspoken rule finally broke into open confrontation. The officer demanded an explanation. The Canadians responded with calm defiance. They did not deny what they were doing. They simply stated the truth. The children were starving, and the rations they shared were the difference between life and death. The officer reminded them that orders were explicit. No food was to be handed to German civilians. Punishment, not charity, was the basis of occupation policy. The Canadians stood their ground. They argued that humanitarian obligations did not disappear with victory, and that enforcing starvation was not a form of justice. The standoff drew attention from nearby troops, creating a tense silence that carried far beyond that warehouse yard. The first official reprimands were issued soon after. Soldiers were warned again that feeding civilians undermined discipline, encouraged dependency, and violated directives agreed upon by the Allied command. Yet the reprimands had an unintended effect. They hardened the resolve of the Canadians. In towns like Wilhelmshaven and Kiel, soldiers began organizing what could only be described as unofficial soup lines. They set up at the edges of barracks, behind vehicle depots, or in the corners of ruined courtyards. A single kettle, guarded by 2 soldiers, would serve dozens of children in minutes before officers made their rounds. Word spread quickly among the locals, and the lines grew longer each day. It was no longer a hidden gesture. It was a challenge to the logic of occupation. By December, humanitarian groups, some from neutral countries, others from allied nations, began documenting the scale of German starvation. Their reports spread through military channels and political offices, forcing commanders to confront a reality that soldiers had been seeing since May. Children were dying at a rate far exceeding anything predicted by policymakers. Malnutrition was rampant. Cities could not rebuild while their youngest citizens struggled to survive another week. Pressure shifted from below and above at the same time. The troops who witnessed starvation demanded leniency. Aid organizations demanded access. And quietly, Canadian officers, having seen their men's actions and the conditions firsthand, pressed for reconsideration of the strict food restrictions. What began with a piece of ration bread slipped to a child in the ruins of a morning patrol had grown into a moral question that the occupation could no longer ignore. Hunger had become the enemy now, and it was proving stronger than policy. And as the final days of 1945 approached, the consequences of these choices began reshaping the future of the entire occupation. When the new year arrived, the harshness of the winter made the crisis impossible to deny. Hospitals in the British zone reported waves of children admitted with severe malnutrition, respiratory infections, and frostbite. Mortality among infants rose sharply. Entire schools operated at half attendance, because so many were too weak to walk. The numbers reached military headquarters, and the tone of official communication began to shift, from punishment to practicality, from control to survival. Administrators realized that a population weakened by hunger could not rebuild infrastructure, clear rubble, or maintain order. The moral argument raised by soldiers on the ground was now strengthened by logistical reality. In early 1946, the British authorities quietly eased the strictest prohibitions on food sharing. Non-fraternization rules, once enforced to prevent sympathy toward the enemy, were formally lifted. Soldiers were allowed to interact with civilians without fear of reprimand. It did not happen instantly, and it did not erase the months of hardship, but it marked the first step in reversing a policy that had proven both unworkable and ethically heavy. The Canadians, who had been among the most persistent in their quiet resistance, found themselves operating within a new space where their acts were no longer subversive but recognized as necessary. Humanitarian organizations, previously restricted by Allied policy, gained wider access. Relief shipments from the Red Cross, the Quakers, and the newly formed CARE program began entering Western Germany. Although supplies were limited, they brought something that had been missing for months: acknowledgement that civilians were not the enemy anymore. The presence of aid workers also brought documentation. Reports highlighted the near collapse of child health, the winter mortality spikes, and the quiet role of Allied soldiers who had intervened long before policy shifted. These accounts circulated in political offices in London, Ottawa, and Washington, where public pressure grew to address Germany's humanitarian crisis. Canadian military records from 1946 show a steady increase in sanctioned community kitchens, school meal programs, and supervised food distributions. Soldiers who once hid their generosity now worked openly to assist local authorities. The very children who had once hovered silently at the edges of barracks were now served hot meals in improvised canteens. The change was not dramatic or cinematic. It was gradual, uneven, and sometimes resisted, but it was real. Compassion, once forbidden, had become part of the occupation's official approach. Yet the cost of the previous months remained visible. Estimates suggest that hundreds of thousands of German civilians suffered severe hunger during the immediate post-war period, with child mortality significantly higher than peacetime norms. The scars, physical and psychological, would last for decades. But within that devastation, small acts of humanity mattered. Canadian soldiers, despite risking reprimand, had prevented deaths that would never appear in official statistics. Their actions became part of local memory. In towns across northern Germany, elderly survivors would later speak of the Canadians who fed us, often referring not to a unit or a name, but a face they remembered from childhood, a soldier who handed them bread when no one else would. As Western policies evolved toward reconstruction and rehabilitation, the earliest signs of this shift could be traced back to moments when individuals chose conscience over regulation. Those decisions helped soften an occupation that might otherwise have remained defined solely by hardship. And as Germany began the slow process of rebuilding, the memory of compassion grew alongside the rebuilding of streets, homes, and institutions. What followed was more than a change in policy. It was the beginning of a different relationship between former enemies, shaped not by treaties or declarations, but by simple acts of mercy carried out in the cold ruins of 1945. And from this foundation of fragile humanity rises the final reflection on what this period meant, not only for Germany, but for the world emerging from the most destructive war in history. History often measures wars by armies, borders, and treaties, but the truth of 1945 lived in quieter places, in the ruins of kitchens with no food to cook, in the hollow eyes of children who had inherited a defeat they never caused, and in the choices made by soldiers who found themselves face to face with a suffering that policy could not justify. Victory had been won. Justice had been delivered. But the world that emerged from the wreckage was fragile, and its stability depended not only on punishment or control, but on the capacity to recognize humanity even in former enemies. For the Canadians who served in northern Germany, the war had taught discipline, endurance, and loyalty. The occupation taught something different, that compassion can be a form of strength. They discovered that mercy did not weaken the victory they had earned. Instead, it revealed what peace required. The moment a soldier slipped bread into a child's hand, the war between them ended in a way no surrender document could achieve. It was a gesture so small, it barely registered in the machinery of history, yet it carried more weight than many political decisions that followed. Over time, those children grew into adults who remembered not only the hunger of 1945, but also the unexpected kindness that reached them in their darkest hour. Their memories became part of a larger narrative, one that touched post-war diplomacy, cultural relationships, and the long process of reconciliation. These acts of compassion did not erase the destruction Germany had caused, nor did they diminish the responsibility for its crimes. But they proved that a humane peace is built by individuals as much as by governments. In the end, the story of 1945 is not simply about the policies that punished a defeated nation or the hardships endured in the months after surrender. It is about the quiet moral choices made in the rubble, choices that challenged rigid rules, softened hardened hearts, and helped shape the foundations of a more stable Europe. And as the smoke of war faded into memory, it became clear that the future was not rebuilt by those who enforced suffering, but by those who eased it. One piece of bread, one act of courage, one child's life at a time.